Hello guys and welcome back to the Try Time podcast. I'm Matt and today we're going to be looking at 10 of the most underwhelming signings in rugby league. These are not league specific, so it can come by any league, and as you'll see, we have a few different reasons as to why these particular adventures were not successful. Without further ado, let's jump straight into the top 10. And at number 10, we have Roy Asah and his move from South Sydney Rabbitohs to the Warrington Wolves. Asah was one of the best props in the NRL. His last match against an English club side was for Canterbury against Leeds in the World Club Challenge, where he was truly exceptional despite the team losing that day. And there was a lot of hype around him being the player to bolster Warrington's pack and really make sure it was their year, and unfortunately it didn't really happen. 2014 was a good year for the Wolves. 15 they ultimately failed to reach the grand final. But despite Asah's departure at the end of the 15 season, they were no worse side in 2016. For all the hype he had and the impact he was expected to make, Warrington coped fine without him, and they were able to use that overseas quota spot on other players, which I think is the biggest testament to Asah's real struggle in Super League. And it's fair to say his impact in Cheshire was not the same as it was in Canterbury or Sydney, and ultimately left Warrington fans a little bit disappointed. Moving on to number 9 now, and this is a player that certainly did not disappoint his fans with the performances on the pitch. Despite a checkered past, Hardaker was coming off the back of a Man of Steel season in 2015, and things just fell apart at Leeds. He was sent on loan to the NRL to play for Penrith for 6 months, where, despite some okay performances, a permanent move never materialised. It was instead his 2017 switch to Castleford that makes our list at number 9, where he played exceptionally in his initial looking good. He was doing well at Castleford, he was a key part of, I'd say, the best cast side to play Super League in the modern era. And things were going great. They were at their first grand final, he was up against his old club Leeds, and it was a real grudge match. The Tigers were ready, they were fired up. And then it was announced, just days before the big game, Hardaker would be suspended. Not because of a high tackle, not because of any sort of on-the-field incident. However, he had failed a drug test. An anti-doping suspension was enforced, and Castleford were left without their star fullback, having to shift top try scorer Greg Eden at the fullback and Jai Hitchcock's on the wing for the big game. That ultimately proved fateful for the Tigers, with Leeds winning on the day, and despite playing so well and his fans being exactly that, such big fans of Hardaker's performances in the season, this left a sour taste in the mouth, and ultimately this was what made him an underwhelming signing for Castleford. Because despite being potentially the man that took them to the grand final, he was ultimately the man that lost them the grand final. At number 8, we're going straight down under to a player lesser known called Dane Laurie. At the very start of the 2010s, he made the move from West Tigers to Penrith Panthers in what was one of the most disappointing transfers in NRL, probably history, despite not being a main, very high-profile player. You'll see this a lot in this video, and there are certain red flags that should maybe say to clubs, don't sign this player, there are reasons he's going. And Laurie was under no exception, leaving West Tigers whilst being subject to criminal proceedings for allegedly assaulting his girlfriend, although the charge was later dismissed, so how much can you really blame him for that one? Despite that, his opening press conference was very critical of his old club, and particularly former coach Tim Sheens. And after lots of niggling injuries, he eventually debuted all the way in round 17, making just 3 appearances over the full season. In a need to get match experience and sharpness, he moved to the French side, Saint-Gaudens Bears. I've probably completely butchered the pronunciation of that one. However, rather than improve his match fitness, this just caused further issues for Lowry. Involved in a legal dispute over damage to a car whilst in France. He was also being accused of drinking heavily on a flight to New Zealand to play in a game for the Windsor Wolves. It was perhaps no surprise that the Panthers cut their losses and released him ahead of 2011. At the end of the year, he did sign a deal to play for Newcastle, which saw him link up with Willie Mason, a player who previously he'd said a lot of negative comments about. However, this was not a return to the NRL for Lowry. His career at top level rugby league was very much done by this point. Moving on to number 7 now, and we have Akili Uate's move from Manly to Huddersfield. A very prolific winger who'd featured as a Fijian international, an Australian international, New South Wales origin star. Uate had over 100 NRL tries from his stint at Newcastle alone, and whilst that was 8 or 9 seasons in length, he certainly knew where the try line was. Or so we thought, with many people expecting him to have a similar impact to Jay McGilvray at Huddersfield. Uate disappointed in his first season, only taking to the pitch 12 times and crossing the whitewash on 5 occasions. There is time for Uate to turn this around, and hopefully we'll look back at this video in a couple of years and think he's completely proved us wrong. What a signing he turned out to be. However, fans that were hoping for a bit more in his second season have so far been left quite disappointed with Uate not really making an impact at the time of recording in Super League suspension. But hey, he's got time. Let's see what happens over the next part of the season. Moving up to number 6 now, and it's Ben Cross's move from Newcastle to the Leeds Rhinos. Another player moving to the Northern Hemisphere, Cross came on recommendation from Rhinos legend Danny Badeiras. However, things weren't quite as rosy in Leeds for him as it was for Danny Budd. Ultimately, he would only play 10 games for the Rhinos before being granted a mid-season release. He was then signed to Wigan, where after 5 appearances, he was once again not returned there. Instead, moving to Widnes ahead of the 2012 season. Now, the Vikings had just been granted a licence to play in Super League, and this would be their inaugural season. And it was there that Ben Cross scored his first ever professional rugby league try in his 10th season. He would go on to score 2 for the club, in fact the only points he'd score at all in his career, before hanging up the boots in the end of the 2013 campaign. The now 41-year-old has moved into coaching, starting out at the Newcastle Knights New South Wales Cup team, and he even won Coach of the Year in March 2016 for the New South Wales Rugby League women's side. So it seems he may have potentially found his bag in coaching, and let's hope that his moves there in the coaching side are going to be a bit more successful than this particular playing move turned out to be. Moving on to number 5, and it's probably one of the quickest stories on this list, and it's Dave Taylor's move from the Canberra Raiders to Toronto Wolfpack. In theory, a signing like Taylor straight out the NRL to the English second division should have been perfect for Toronto. He'd played in Super League for Catalan, he knew the English game well. And I'm sure he'd have been a great player had he have ever made his debut. However, in an incident in a training camp in Portugal where reportedly they have twice broken the curfew, Taylor, along with teammates Ryan Bailey and Fuifui Moimoi, were released from the club, meaning that for all the promise and all the fact, the Toronto fans were truly hyped to get a player like Taylor in through the door. And he didn't even pull on the jersey. I mean, say what you want if Sonny Bill's been a disappointment, but at least he's actually got on the pitch for Toronto. More than Taylor could manage. Talk about underwhelming. Moving on to number 4 now, and we've got something a bit different, because rather than a specific club, Todd Carney's struggles in Super League were so poor and so bad. We just thought we'd put his entire time in England to this, and France actually, to this entry. Now, if ever a player comes with red flags, it's Todd Carney. He was coming off the back of Dally M58 of the Year award in 2013, his second in his career. So in theory, he should have been heading into the 2014 season with Cronulla on form. However, in June he was sacked after a leaked photograph appearing to show him urinating in his own mouth was released, and yeah, I have no idea, that's just disgusting. He was already on a warning for behavioural issues, so much so the NRL's COO Jim Doyle was quoted as saying, "I'd be surprised if any club would show interest in signing him considering his checkered history, and even if they did, it was unlikely the NRL would agree to register him." This actually followed him to England, where he struggled to get any sort of visa, and forced him with one option, a move to the south of France. I mean, it's not bad, is it, really? I'm sure it's quite nice living in the south of France. And I'm sure Carney enjoyed it. But I don't think he enjoyed his time on the pitch quite so much. He was never a bad player for Catalans, but he never really got the ground running. And for a player that had absolutely dominated the NRL and Origin, you would not have seen it looking at the bloke lining out for Catalans. He just wasn't the same player. It said a lot that after his 2 years in France, he was not returned. He instead moved to Salford, where again he only lasted a season. He bounced around a few clubs in 2018. Looking to revitalise his NRL career, he started out at Northern Pride, moved to training to North Queensland Cowboys for less than a month, returned to Sydney citing family issues to sign for the North Sydney Bears, refused to pay $150,000 in compo to Northern Pride, not even paying $15,000 for a release, which for the career he's had £7,500 roughly. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but he wasn't paying it. He instead moved in July to Hull KR, where, despite being on the pitch for some good wins, he played 6 games, didn't score a point. The only place in his career he's never actually scored a single point, and that was really the last we saw of him. Certainly, again, at top level rugby league. If any of you from Australian fans know where he is now, please let us know in the comments. Moving into our top 3 now, and we've got another NRL player here, and it's Beau Falloon's move from the Gold Coast Titans up to the Leeds Rhinos. It's a very similar story to Ben Cross in this one. Leeds needed some new blood off the back of losing Jamie Peacock, Kylie Luluai and Kevin Sinfield, and along with Keith Galloway, Falloon was meant to revitalise the squad. However, similar to Cross, he just featured 10 times before getting released. An injury on his first ever appearance, the Boxing Day friendly against Wakefield, perhaps foreshadowed the lack of impact he would have at the club, where, whilst all efforts were focused on the loss of the big 3 mentioned earlier, Paul Ayton's departure was going a bit more unnoticed ahead of the 2016 season, largely as a result of injury keeping him out of the latter half of the trebles winning year 2. Falloon's initial 1-year contract would not see out the full year, and he was instead replaced by James Segeyaro, who also enjoyed a similarly short stint at Headingley, although one that was much more successful. Falloon hasn't really been seen in rugby since, so again, if any of you know what he's been up to, please do let us know. And yeah, without much more to say on him, we go into the top 2. There we have Kevin Locke's move from the New Zealand Warriors to Salford Red Devils. After losing his spot, or certainly facing a lot more competition from Sam Tompkins in 2013, the still very young Kevin Locke was only in his mid-20s and was expected to really go on to be one of the best fullbacks in the NRL. So it was quite a surprise and a big coup when Salford managed to negotiate an early release from his New Zealand contract and signed a 3-year deal with the Kiwi international, finding off competition from Scottish rugby union sides Edinburgh and Glasgow. It was, however, not the season in Super League that Locke might have hoped for. 6 tries and 10 goals in 13 appearances were the highlights of a tricky 18 months where he often lost out on time on the pitch. In fact, in June 15, he departed the club for then bottom side Wakefield Trinity, which, if I remember rightly, I believe that was the year they only picked up 2 wins throughout the whole campaign. I was at the one before. That might have been the one where London were routed to the foot of the table. Now, I'm pretty sure London went down in 14. Regardless, they were still at the bottom. Locke only played 5 times for Wakefield Trinity and scored 2 tries, so not a bad return, but he couldn't command anything more than a short-term contract. Instead, he moved to Shute Shield Rugby Union side Southern Districts and then joined the West Sydney Rams in the NRC. It wasn't the best time code switching for Locke, and he spent a lot of the year in the lower grades. He then signed a contract in November 16 to link up with the Manly Sea Eagles. However, he was released during pre-season. A move to the Sunshine Coast Falcons in the Queensland Cup didn't amount to much, and his last known game was in the Fox Memorial Shield for the Point Chevrolet Pirates. It's hard to think he's still only 31 and should in theory be in his prime, and he's gone all the way from being the star fullback for New Zealand at club and country to now nowhere. But he still couldn't quite top this list, because that honour goes to Kieran Foran, whose move from Manly to Parramatta was widely considered one of the biggest wastes of money in NRL history. In fact, it's only saved by the fact Foran agreed to a release. So where did things go so wrong? Signed as the joint captain, expectations were high for Kieran after some good years at Manly, and with a lot of potential and years ahead of him, many thought he could be the man to help click Parramatta into place, especially following. This was around the time Chris Sandow left to join Warrington. So Parramatta were in the midst of needing halfbacks at this point, but Foran was not the answer. Despite things starting out okay, it was in April it all unravelled. Rushed to hospital in an ambulance after a prescription overdose, he was granted indefinite leave. Reports came out he'd been struggling due to pressure of the NRL, a breakdown in his relationship after just recently his partner giving birth to their second child, and sponsor disputes with Manly over $140,000, as well as Parramatta's salary cap scandal. A week later, Jackie O made comments about Foran and his ex-partner, particularly regarding the paternity of the club's child. Foran announced legal action would be taken against the radio host and ultimately won that case. Now, while this doesn't affect his life on the rugby pitch, this was certainly a key indicator that things were only going to get worse for Kieran. After losing $75,000 on a gambling binge in South Africa, including $20,000 on one particular horse race, the horse came last. He was really struggling and had checked into rehab at this point. And he was starting to get back into playing though while all this was going on. He did ultimately suffer a season-ending shoulder injury in the win over Newcastle in round 12 of the season. However, he was then stripped of his captaincy in late June and fined for unprofessional conduct after not turning up to rehab and instead drinking heavily whilst being injured. Due to these personal issues, he announced that he would possibly never play rugby league again, and the very next month it was announced that he'd been released for his contract to sort out his personal life. Just 9 matches and 1 try for the Eels was not the impact expected for their joint captain and major signing. He would go on to spend a season with the New Zealand Warriors in 2017 where he started to repair some of the damage. Certainly was helped being back in his home country, because despite not really starting his career at New Zealand, he was still an Auckland native, and this would have been going home for Foran. He then moved back to Canterbury in 2018, where he's been pretty steady actually. We've seen shades of the old Foran, and certainly he looks like he's back on track. 26 appearances over the course of 2 seasons with 4 tries. He will unfortunately miss the most of this season due to a shoulder injury, and his contract is up at the end of the year. So we wait and see what his next move is going to be and whether or not he'll remain in the NRL. But what can't be argued was his time at Parramatta was ultimately disappointing, particularly off the back of such a successful spell at Manly. So they were our 10 most underwhelming signings. There were some good shout-outs in there that didn't quite make the list. Willie Mason at Hull KR, Seguiero at Leeds. I'm sure we've missed some others, so let us know in the comments or whatever platform you're viewing this from. Who was the worst signing for your club? Who should we have included? And yeah, until next time, I've been Matt. If you've not already, check out lots of our other videos all on the channel. And we will be back next week with some more Rugby League content. Until then, stay home, stay safe, and have the best time you can in lockdown. Thank you. Goodbye.